Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Ira Michael Heyman, who is an emeritus professor of law and of city and regional planning at UC Berkeley. Professor Heyman was Chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley from 1980 to 1990, counselor to the Secretary and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Interior, 1993 to 1994, and Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution from 1994 to 1999. Professor Heyman, welcome back to Berkeley.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in New York City, and I was raised in New York City.
And how did your parents shape your character, do you feel, in retrospect?
It's really hard to say. I had a father who was, in many ways, an expansion, had lots of expansion, had lots of ways in. Was a man who children really liked a lot, who young children in the family over time spent a lot of time with him, found him to be a person you really could speak with, one who was quite sympathetic to what your viewpoints were and what your problems were. I had a mother who was a beautiful woman, who was a school teacher for 35 years. Both parents were very interested in charitable undertakings, especially charitable camp. I was an only child, and I was the product of people like that, but it's hard to say in the abstract what shaped me coming from that union.
Are the roots of your commitment to liberal values to be found in your home?
I think down deep my father was really a liberal, although you wouldn't know it by his political affiliation. He voted for Roosevelt the first two times, but not the third when Roosevelt ran against Wilkie. But both my parents were very involved with the progressive movement in New York City and were great supporters of LaGuardia, and they had gotten themselves into local politics quite a bit. But he was a person who believed in inclusion, and he was a person, while running in office, believed that the people who were the employees ought to have a stake in it. So he had a lot of the kinds of values that I think are at the core of liberalism. My mother was disassociated from that so much. But in her work as a school teacher, she taught in a poor neighborhood in New York on the Lower West Side, which now is pretty ritzy in the Chelsea district, but at that time it wasn't at all. And in the era in which she taught, she not only was the school teacher of the 5th grade, but she was sort of the social worker in the neighborhood.
Any books that you read as a young person that sort of impacted you or that you still remember?
Oh, I do. I remember some of them. I read voraciously as a young teenager, especially. And I read a lot of books that explored the pathos of poverty and folks who were at that end of the spectrum. I read a lot of Theodore Dreiser. I read a lot of Thomas Wolfe. I read Steinbeck. I read those kinds of authors. And either they fed a predisposition or they formed in me a set of political attitudes.
And where were you educated before you went to college?
I went to a public school in New York, and then I went to a public junior high school in New York. Then I went to the Bronx High School of Science, which is a public high school. And then for the last 3 years, I went to a private school, a prep school, to enable me to play basketball, football, and baseball, and be on the swimming team.
So what did you learn from all those sports activities?
I liked it a lot. I was very tall when I was very young. I wasn't the most coordinated fellow, but I was probably better coordinated as a big fellow in that era than most. And so I played athletics quite well. And it reinforced, I think height meant a lot. It reinforced my position in leadership, which really did occur at that time. And I did quite well in athletics.
Then for college, you went to Dartmouth.
I went to Dartmouth.
And any teachers there or any subjects that took your fancy?
Well, two people I remember with great fondness and who were very formative for me was a fellow named Bob Carr, who taught in government, taught public law, mostly constitutional, my first constitutional law course. And then a fellow named Don Morrison, who was also dean of the faculty. He also was a government professor, and he taught mostly administrative law. But he was the fellow who found and resurrected a fellowship at Dartmouth that in the end meant that I went to Washington for my senior year and worked in the United States Senate.
And what did you do there?
I started out as an intern with a Republican senator from New York, and I ended up as his legislative assistant. It seems odd in these days, but the substantive staff in that office consisted of his administrative assistant, his executive secretary, and me. That's for a senator from the most populous state in the United States. The reason I didn't go or seek to go with Senator Lehman, who was the Democrat, is that Lehman was quite wealthy, and he had brought on 30 people or so from his own assets, and I thought I'd get lost there.
So that was your first encounter with private financing of public,
public
funding. So, but then you went on to law school. So what, other than the influences we've already discussed, why did you decide to become a lawyer?
Oh, I think that I really enjoyed the law-related courses at Dartmouth, but I think it was primarily my experience in Washington that indicated to me that if you wanted to play a public role, at least in politics, it was very advantageous to be a lawyer, not only in terms of the subject matter, but because the career really permitted you to be a self-starter. So you could serve either in administrative or in legislative politics. Then you could get out, but you could work because you had a skill that was portable.
Before we talk about, well, let's talk a little about your law school. You were at Yale, and you were on the law review there,
yes.
Right. So what in the end, what skills did you get in your training as a lawyer that were useful and helpful as you entered into all these management roles that you later had at Berkeley and then at the Smithsonian?
Well, it's where I learned to read.
That's good.
And I must say that being at Yale was a special treat because the student body is so good, and it was small enough so that you could really have intimate discussion groups, and so I learned a lot from that kind of experience. But you learn an awful lot about governance. You do, because in so many ways law is really the authoritative or seemingly authoritative statement that comes out that's crucial to governance.
And you really learn to think about issues from different perspectives?
Oh, clearly. You know, every time there's an appellate decision, for instance, you're reading about the resolution of conflicting arguments. And so many of the cases that you read in law school are very important ones. And you usually had two quite skilled counsel and quite ethical counsel, not in the sense that they told the other fellow's story, but they didn't tell a false story themselves. So working on a single record that had been established in the lower courts, you got two different takes on those facts, well argued, and then you got a resolution of that set of conflicting arguments by the court. A way of dealing with life, especially in institutions, that is very appealing to me.
And also touching base with reality and applying ideals to the real world?
Well, that does certainly occur in that method of teaching, which has been, at least during my lifetime, the principal way of teaching in law school, which is a very Socratic method in which you're getting your students to really participate deeply in that conversation so that those who do their work and all the rest get deeper and deeper and deeper into the subject matter. But you're right, on the one hand, you're talking about ideals, especially in subjects like constitutional law. And on the other hand, you're talking about reality. And maybe you develop the sense that I've had, which is that perhaps the real genius of the American system is not that we behave so well, but that we have a set of written ideals that keep pulling us in the right direction, and really do operate in that way. And I think, for instance, the reparations to Japanese Americans after the Second World War, which could never be significant in terms of what we did with those people's lives, but was such a symbolic gesture on the part of the United States, recognizing that it had done wrong, and largely in terms of constitutional principles, as far as I'm concerned.
When you were leaving the Smithsonian, you said in a speech, at the heart, I believe, all of our work in the law is a belief in process. The way things are done matter to us. Time after time in my life at the Smithsonian, I find myself asking how a decision was made, what expectations were built into a particular strategy, who was present at the table, how clearly were purposes articulated. And then you go on to say that it got you to thinking about the bigger picture, your studies in the law.
Well, you know, lawyers really are 90% process and 10% substance. But the process is substance, if you will, because what that means to me and meant to me at the time that I wrote it is that if you're very thorough in terms of process, and if you're very thorough in terms of an organized and sensible way to make sure that it's been an inclusionary decision, so that a lot of people have participated in it, the soundness of the decision is usually is enhanced. And I think that especially occurs to lawyers. And while others have other things that they stress, I think it's very sound in the management of a place where you really want it to be decentralized and not have all the decisions come to the center. And the way that you try to assure a good practice is to assure that the folks out there really are following sound processes, and then the number of times you have to make a decision are much, much lessened.
Now, when you finished law school, you had the extraordinary opportunity for a year to be the chief clerk to the chief judge of the United States Supreme Court, Earl Warren. Tell us about that experience and how you think it impacted you as a young lawyer, as somebody who obviously was concerned about values and who was about to go out in the world and run some of our major institutions.
I'll tell you that in a moment, but what you said reminded me of something. That my career has been one that's been very serendipitous. I've really not thought about what's going to happen at any stage of this thing. When I applied to Yale, which is a very hard law school to get into, I was then called up to active duty in the Marine Corps, which meant I couldn't attend, but I went through all the process in any event. And my grades were okay. They were really pretty good, and my LSAT score was very good, but the competition is enormous. That year, Yale took in twice as many as it normally does because it thought it would lose a lot of those whom it admitted to service. Well, it turned out they didn't. It was a huge class. Only a few of us went. But it certainly enhanced my opportunity to be admitted that it was such a huge class. So I came back from service 2 years later, and what was Yale going to do? Not honor what they had done in terms of this man who had fought for his country, or at least had served during a war. So, of course, they let me in. And then I went through law school, and I did okay. I went and practiced law for a year because I really wanted to test how it was to practice law. But my wife and I were living in New Haven. She was getting her graduate degree in history of art from Yale. I was commuting to New York to practice law. It was arduous. And then the chief judge of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the intermediate federal court of appeals, but the Second Circuit has got a lot of very juicy cases because it's New York, Connecticut, and Vermont. He lost his law clerk to the Air Force at the last moment. So he asked me, will I do it? And he asked me largely because his clerk up till then was a classmate of mine from Yale. So I said, I went to the firm, I asked them, they said, fine, take a leave of absence, and thus I went to work for him. That Christmas, I was in Florida seeing my grandparents. My wife and I had gone down. I came back, went into the office. There's a phone call that I'm meant to return to the Chief Justice of the United States. I find out at that point that Yale had put me in for that clerkship because Warren liked to have at least one clerk with Court of Appeals experience. So I went down, I saw him, he said, we'll do fine. I go back to the law firm and I say, how about another year? They say, fine. So that's another piece of serendipity that occurs. There are more later in life, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that being open to opportunity and not being absolutely determinative with regard to goal can be very nice and can be very productive. Now, you asked me about Warren and what my views of him were, and how did that affect me? Well, there were two things about Warren that really affected me deeply. One is that he's a genuine American hero, and what I mean by that is that certainly at the time that he was Chief Justice of the United States, he was an exceedingly principled man. He was an enormously human man. He could bring that to bear on the conflicts that came before the court. And he was obdurate and stubborn about those values. And I expect most of us have forgotten, but he was under tremendous pressure in the United States. The John Birch Society was after him. There were huge billboards in many places in the United States about lynching Warren, or at least impeaching him. The pressure was immense, and he didn't waver at all. In fact, practically every day, he walked to the court with Tom Clerk, who was then an Associate Justice, and they walked together from out about 2 miles away to work. No Secret Service men, no nothing. And but that was the kind of a person that he was. So he really was a hero, and he certainly was to me, given his values. And then on the second was that while I had concluded that I really did want to try teaching, he was the one who steered me to Berkeley. I had never seen Berkeley. I was interviewed by some members of the faculty. They accepted me without being interviewed here, and I accepted coming here without ever seeing it. It's worked out well, but really it was Warren who steered me.
Let's move to this question of managing large public organizations, because I want to bring all these issues together. But before we do that, there's one issue that we touched on, and that was your service in the Marines. And what did you get out of that? What were you left with that experience that affected your role as a leader in the future?
Well, the first thing I got out of it was another instance in which I could conform myself to the social milieu that I was in the midst of. I really enjoyed the Marine Corps. I went in as an officer. I had a platoon, then I had a battery. That's a platoon in a company. I was relatively young. I was just turned 21. This was an awful lot of responsibility. It worked out well. I enjoyed exercising that responsibility. And I even flirted with the idea of staying. My wife flirted with the idea of leaving me if I did. So I didn't. But it was a great time for me of maturation and really taking on responsibility for a number of people.
You went on, as we know, to head the University of California at Berkeley and the Smithsonian Institution. And I'm interested in understanding what you see as the requirements of leadership in important educational and cultural organizations like this. Now, I find several themes that emerge as part of your carrying the portfolio. And one of the responsibilities, it seemed to me, that you had was responding to great societal change as you led these institutions, helping them adapt to, for example, in the case of the university, affirmative action, in the case of the Smithsonian, great changes in our understanding of the importance of the museum in relating to our history. So I guess what I want to know is, looking back, what key skills that you acquired or learned were really important in both jobs?
That's a hard question.
Yeah.
The first statement I want to make is there are many ways to lead well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it's terribly important that you lead from your own psychological makeup and whatever is inside of you, and you act pretty much naturally rather than trying to assume another persona. And thus, there are wonderful leaders who lead very differently than I do, and some quite more successfully, but in any event, and some less. But you have to be what you are. Part of that is obviously personality and a personal psychology, and I have found in that regard that I've wanted to be liked. I don't know if excessively, but certainly sufficiently. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that does do is that it makes you see the other guy's side of the affair, because you're really trying to get the other fella to accept bad news very often. Mm-hmm. And to do that, you've got to really be sympathetic or empathetic with that person's reactions. That came from someplace, and I don't know where that came from, mm-hmm. but that is one part of my character that I know about. A second thing for me was that during the time that I taught, for all that period of time from 59 through 74, and then I continued teaching some, but from 59 to 74, when I was both in law school and then law school in city and regional planning, my outside work, outside of teaching, consisted of working with a number of organizations, the principal ones being regional environmental agencies in California. So I worked with the Bay Conservation Development Commission, I worked with the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, and I was beginning to work with the Coastal Zone Commission. And I always defined what I was doing more broadly than solely the law part of this. Mm-hmm. And maybe the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency was the major one, in which another fellow with whom I became very close, Bob Twiss, in landscape architecture at Berkeley in the College of Environmental Design, and I, in many ways, devised the planning system up there. Mm-hmm. And then I wrote all the ordinances, and he wrote supportive materials, but we worked very, very closely. That was a very tough political situation if you were going to get anything done, and it really meant that you had to consult very widely with people in California, mainly politicians and administrators, and the board itself, and then people in Nevada. Very different kind of people with very different agenda. That taught me a lot about how you get things done. We got that done, and we got it done with very little rancor, interestingly enough, but it really meant bringing people along. The other thing it meant was being very clear about your objectives and being very honest about those objectives. So when I came in to running big institutions, it was just normal for me to do some things which very often people don't do, and I don't understand it. Mm-hmm. One is to state with as much specificity as you can what it is that you want to get done during the period you're going to be in that job. Secondly, is to really highlight that and state it in ways that are really simple so that everybody understands it. And then thirdly, during the period of time that you're in that job, is constantly being aware of those objectives and constantly trying to manage towards them. And then doing all the other things that you have to do, but in terms, so that you've got an understandable thread that goes through. And as I reread recently my inauguration speech here, I had about 5 objectives. By the way, you can't have any more than 5 or 6 if you're going to get anything done. And then I read a speech I made when I was finishing up as chancellor. The objectives were the same, and you could see progress or non-progress, but mostly progress. One of the things that does is that when you're in a big complex organization like Berkeley or like the Smithsonian, you're trying to affect a lot of people, and you're trying to get them to go in a particular direction. When you state what you think is right and what you're going to work towards, about 80% of the people feel very relieved that there's a direction. And they really like working in that. Now, I mean, there are people who are going to disagree with you, and you've got to be open to comment and consultation and the like. But a lot of people, in any event, feel very comforted and comfortable having a direction specified. And if I think that if there's anything to applaud, if that's a way of putting it, in terms of my activity in these jobs, it's specificity, consistency, and looking at these things from the point of view of the people who are unhappy or potentially unhappy with direction or with specific decisions.
Now, one of the results of this process that you've just described is getting people who are the organization, who run the organization, to rethink their values in light of pressures from outside. And so, as you suggested, you learned in this environmental work to listen to all the voices out there related to a particular issue. But then there is a job of educating, isn't there, about what these new voices have? Yeah.
I've always thought, by the way, in terms of first of all, you've got to educate. If you're going to take a point of view that is inconsistent with the point of view of a number of people in your organization, you simply have to educate, devise ways of educating, and listen and argue. I mean, you've got to get into the trenches and really argue your case. It can't simply be done by the exercise of authority. But when I came in at Berkeley, there were of the 6 objectives, there were only 2 that were controversial. One was affirmative action, but there I really feel the kind of passion for whatever set of reasons that I feel about inclusion, both pragmatically in terms of what this society is and is surely becoming, and also on moral grounds. So it's both a pragmatic and a moral side to it from my perspective. And I just argued very vigorously and constantly and finagled and did all the kind of things to try to make that successful. At the Smithsonian, the big thing was, what are the roles of curators? Are they people who are bringing presentation that are educating people about, at least on occasion, controversial matters from different viewpoints, or are they people who are organizing and designing their exhibitions to enhance a particular point of view? The latter is what most curators want to be, because they want to see themselves as intellectual historians. On the other hand, my view about what you do in museums in terms of controversy is not to run from it, but on the other hand, to give a fair shake to opposing points of view. That's not a very comfortable position for curators. And I spent, I'd say, 4.5 years at the Smithsonian making that argument, going around, making the argument, fielding questions. I mean, spending a lot of personal time in trying to deal with that. And I had some moderate success in it. The fact that I was passionate about it and I would talk about it openly and not in a condemnatory way brought people around to do it even if they didn't really agree with it. It was in part because of the manner in which one sought to bring that result to bear.
Now let's look at affirmative action at Berkeley, and you've given us insight here in to sort of what was motivating you and and what are the skills that you brought to bear in dealing with this. But in an issue like affirmative action, your constituencies weren't on board, and there was really conflict with different constituencies and their relation to different goals. So I would imagine that on the one hand, one of your problems was to fundraise, to find new sources of money. On the one hand, the other was affirmative. Did these two goals conflict?
Well, they eventually did, but it was after I left.
I see.
No, I took the position with givers, most of whom, or practically all of whom, are Caucasian, and whose grandchildren often, because that was their age, were finding it very tough to get into Cal. The position that what the university was doing was what it always did. It was really trying to be a place where people who were deprived economically and for other reasons could get a fair shake with respect to the credential and the educational process. It's very hard to disagree with that. Now, the one basic condition that had changed is that it was really, when I started as Vice Chancellor in 1974, we were taking practically every eligible kid who wanted to come to Berkeley, and we were just making our quota. And you know, under those circumstances, this argument's an easy one.
Yeah.
But by the time I had to make it, or certainly in the middle of the 80s when I was making this argument, people were being turned around. So there was a shortage of opportunity.
And your applicants were 4 times as much, I think I read.
And the applicants went up immensely.
Yeah.
So it was, but the idea of equality and inclusiveness and this place, unlike some of its competitors, really being in the business of giving a pathway up for people who had been deprived. You know, it's so much the warp and the whoop of this place, or warp, or whatever that word is of this place, that it dealt effectively in terms of people making contribution with a lot of the people with whom I spoke. So there it was really finding a way to argue this that was true, even though upsetting under the circumstances. So that was really quite helpful.
Yeah, you quoted from the Faculty Senate in one of your speeches, and they had said in the 90s that Berkeley must have a larger vision of its mission. This mission must include taking a leadership role in the construction of a genuinely pluralistic environment in which the best students from all segments of California's diverse population can meet and debate in an atmosphere of enlightenment and commitment. Because another goal on your agenda was really to reflect the diversity that the demographers were telling you were in California and going to be a reality.
Yeah. And for a number of reasons. Again, in terms of one's own sense of what is the right kind of an institution for the United States, but also in sense of 20 years from now. I mean, I really would hope that a good deal of the leadership in California comes from people who were forced to mix with one another, or contend or do something other than looking at a distance from one another with regard to that leadership.
Yeah.
And I think we're only beginning to see this now. I mean, as folks of Hispanic background are beginning to become politically very important in this state, in the legislature, those were the kinds of things that I foresaw in terms of the position that I took then. I must say, it's an issue that's a very difficult. It's not a resolvable issue. People who believe in individualism to a large degree, who are not anti-communitarian, but that's not what sends them. It's individual achievement and individual effort. And especially people who came from backgrounds in which members of their group were discriminated against, are just enormously sensitive about this, whether or not they came from that background. And the other really takes a commitment to do some sacrifice in relationship to communitarian goals. But it's very tough. I mean, you get people on this end of the spectrum and people on this, and it's very hard to bring them together.
In one of your first articles, a very important article as a young faculty member entitled Innovative Land Regulation and Comprehensive Planning, which was really about land use and finding ways that the law could respond to new values, concerns about the environment. You emphasized in both what we're finding in the law and I think in terms of your values, finding rationality, equality, and ways that organizations could respond to changes in value. That theme is here again and again.
Yes.
I mean, it really is, in this case of affirmative action, almost applying that set of norms to a different case. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is fair. I had not thought about it that way. I really had put them in different capsules of time. But yeah, I think that one's basic values pretty much steer you, regardless of setting.
And I guess in this work, and on an entirely different subject, which is one of your important tasks was to reorganize the biological sciences, which is a very different subject. But here, I would imagine there's a lot of convincing of people within the organization that they have to rethink their ways of doing things.
Speaking about biology.
Biology, but also in terms of affirmative action.
Yes.
That in other words, you have to find, you have to draw on your skills as a lawyer to explain, to convince, to press the flesh, whatever, to get people to say, oh yeah, I see what you're saying, or at least I'll think about it.
Well, I really think they're distinguishable in a funny way with regard to their accomplishment. On affirmative action, it really does take a perception of a proper morality in the end. And you push, and a lot of people hadn't given that so much. It fits within what you said. In the biological revolution at Berkeley, it didn't have very much to do with that. What it had to do was our own sense of self-worth. And everybody agreed with that. And everybody agreed that unless we had taken a terrible slide in the ratings in the biological sciences, where we had always been quite prominent. But in the 1980s, we had really taken it in the chin. And we only had 1 or 2 departments that were in the top 10 anymore. We had 19 biology departments at Berkeley at that time. And it was just absolutely, well, actually, maybe it was the 70s. I forgot which one it was. I think it was the 70s, actually. But it was just clear we had to do something. And then it was clear that we had antiquated facilities, and we just simply had to upgrade those. And then it became perfectly clear after and this was Rod Park more than, and Dan Koshland more than me, concluded we had to have the most prestigious of outside reviewers come in and take a look at us in general and tell us what was wrong with us in order to bring along. But the basic value was we had to be up and top of the ratings and that biology was the science of tomorrow. And you know, then there were going to be people who got hurt in the sense that they lost authority that they previously had. There were going to be a melding of a whole bunch of departments. We very wisely concluded that our real consultative group here were going to be the 35 to 45-year-olds on the various biology, and then we worked out a strategy. But the end result, everybody agreed with. So it was an issue of quite how you get there, and it was such a rational plan to get there. Now, I mean, the hard things, in a funny way, were, first of all, to devise that plan. That was Park and Koshland. Secondly, was to convince the legislature. That was mine. And thirdly, was to raise money in general, and that was more mine. So, but it was a real team effort with respect to its accomplishment.
But emphasizing, I'm hearing you saying that excellence, continuing excellence, renewed excellence, required new processes and new institutional forms.
That's true, but everybody agreed on the goal.
I see. It was just how you get from here.
That's right.
How do you get from there?
That's right.
Now at the Smithsonian, you take the position, and the first thing that lands on your desk is, or one of the first things, is an exhibit the Enola Gay exhibit, which is a presentation about the meaning of the dropping of the atomic bomb. And so in some ways, you found something on your desk that really told you a lot about how museum work was changing and how it had to change. Tell us a little about that.
Well, of course, it all had been planned. You know, the show wasn't up. It was in draft form in terms of its script. And the Air Force Journal, I guess, had blown the whistle on its contents, and in a kind of biased way, but nevertheless had done it. And a great, an enormous amount of criticism ensued from every place, all over the United States, and all of the editorial pages, including the Washington Post, which was really rather interesting. The New York Times didn't weigh in with this until way after a decision got made and then criticized us, but it didn't say a word at the time that all this was occurring. Any event, it was a very, very uncomfortable kind of a circumstance. And what we sought to do is to judiciously rewrite the script.
In the script, explain for our audience, the script essentially took one vantage point on the story.
Let me say this, what it really did. First, let me say about it chronologically, in relationship to the use of the hydrogen weapon, the atomic bomb, I'm sorry. It took, chronologically, it started in 1945. It did have a little of Okinawa in it, but that's it. Everything was prospective. So you might say that in terms of trying to make any kind of a judgment with regard to the use of that weapon, you might have wanted to start in 1941 with Pearl Harbor, or you might want to have started in 1937 with Nanking. I mean, you know, there was a rich background with regard to the decision, but it started in 1945. They did try to do something about this, but the curators of the show refused to put it in. So the director had to get somebody else to organize another show, which would, but I think that would have had a possibility of working out. Then secondly, it spent a good deal of its time on the horrors that occurred in Hiroshima. And it could have done less, but it did quite a lot. It's hard to fight with that, but again, it depends upon what emphasis is. Thirdly, it had a lot of wallboards, which try to describe what were the events that occurred in the decision-making process. And it took a particular point of view, to a greater extent than any other point of view, which was a revisionist one. There's nothing wrong with revisionism. That's what historians are all about. But it didn't take the conventional explanation and put it together with the other. It just used the rather unconventional one, or less conventional. And then lastly, it spent a very large portion of its time on what happened in civilian life in the United States because of the threat of atomic warfare. So the show really couldn't have been better designed to say that Truman not only made a mistake pragmatically, because the war otherwise would have been over, but also it made an immoral decision. And I think that's true. I mean, I think that the people who wrote that script believed that. I mean, you know, I don't think this was an evil thing they were doing.
So they were conveying.
But they were conveying what they believed was true. And I learned a lot about a lot of things that I hadn't known, not the least being what the power of the media is and how difficult it is to dislodge a viewpoint that is established once it's established at scale.
That is the viewpoint of the exhibit, or?
No, the viewpoint of the criticism of the exhibit and the characterization of the exhibit. I couldn't get people to come off that. I really couldn't, and we spent a lot of time trying to say to people, look, we're changing it, this, that, and the other thing. But we were trying to negotiate having some people on our side, because nobody was on our side, or at least nobody would come out of the woodwork and say they were on our side, but have people on our side who legitimated a broader view than the narrowest of historical views in the United States. And we were doing pretty well, actually, with the American Legion, where they weren't going to say it's a great show, but they were going to say it's a respectable show. And then the folks over at Air and Space just pulled some ridiculously impolitic things that just made that impossible. And then I just decided there was no way that we were going to be able to put on this show that the decision had been made already largely in the public that what we were doing was vilifying the president and vilifying the veterans, I mean, by inference. And so I just decided we'd start all over again.
Museums, you point out in one of your...
That was very tough, because I know that if I had been secretary during the preparation of this show, it wouldn't have come out quite that way.
That's right. That's right.
And I would have spent a lot of time cajoling, arguing, jumping up and down, doing all the stuff that you do to try to get somebody to change
And this is consistent with something you said in a speech when you were leaving the Smithsonian after the end of your tenure. Our obligation is to provide a national place where the many communities of America can learn about each other and honor each other's past and present. We are bound together as a people, not in uniformity, but in shared hope. And if we get it right, mutual respect.
Yes.
So it's really, again, about the theme of inclusiveness, which
it certainly. That was my affirmative action. I really had this great opportunity. We were starting the process of reconstituting, it's really the word, the Star-Spangled Banner, the flag that flew over Fort McHenry in the War of 1812, and about which the Star-Spangled Banner was written. And we were rethreading it and doing all the kinds of things you do to really preserve it thereafter. Well, it was such a great media event, number one. And number two, it fit right into Mrs. Clinton's Millennium Program. And she convinced Ralph Lauren to give $10 million towards this project, which was really needed. But they really wanted, everybody wanted a media event out of this. So the president came and Mrs. Clinton came. And Ralph Lauren came, he didn't speak, but the president spoke and I spoke. We were the really two speakers. But it was such an opportunity for me to push a theme that I really constantly wanted to push, but I didn't have that kind of opportunity otherwise, which was essentially to give a speech about one of the great missions of the Smithsonian was inclusiveness. And I had that opportunity. Of course,
and that's where you said...
And that's where I said this.
That, and I think that your background, your legal training, gave you an incisive look of this new roles that museums have to play, basically, in this world, where there are arguments about past history as part of a process of including new groups of people.
Yes. Let me say two things about that. That, first of all, the emergence of under-included people into our world has to, that's a great event, and that has to at least be facilitated, in my view, by national museums. That's my view, and so I was pushing that in there. The second point I forget at the moment, but that was a very important point for me. Oh no, I guess the second thing I wanted to say was this, and the reason that I momentarily forgot it, because it comes out of another stream. Museums, historically, were either art museums or places for curiosities or places for single items, all standing alone. But their very inclusion in the museum made them terribly important. And the curator's job was to choose which ones would be there, okay? And there wasn't fight about that. If it was there, then it was important. If it was there, then it was beautiful. If it was there, then it was a legitimate object of culture. Well, what's happened in museums is that we have gone from the era, which was a long era, of the museums as sacred in the sense of giving to these objects a sacred quality by their choice, to a place where you really ought to discuss the importance either of those objects or of whatever it is that you're trying to do in narratives. And by the way, at the same time we went from the collection of objects, curiosities, paintings, etc., we have gotten now more interested, at least from time to time, of being places of narration, of telling a story using the objects to tell a story. And what those who have argued for this have constantly said is that museums ought to be places of discussion. They ought to be fora. They ought to be places where various viewpoints are brought together, which has a parallel with various people, but it comes from a different stream. And I embrace that. I mean, I think we ought to have both for reasons that I've stated from time to time, but I embrace that. But museums are not like universities. Because in universities, I can say something that is startling or have a view, an interpretation, and Harry's going to come over and say, you're full of baloney, and we're going to have to fight about that. That doesn't happen in museums. In museums, you put up a full show, and it's there, and people come in and look at it, and then people go away. So if you're going to really be a forum, you've got to take special efforts to be a forum and to inform about different viewpoints. And then you really can let people make up their mind rather than simply trying to react to a complex story told by the curator. So I really argued strenuously that having gone from a place of adoration to a place of narration, we owed a real a professional responsibility to show more than one side of the controversy.
In one of your last speeches at the Smithsonian, you're talking about the effect of this national exhibit where important objects from our national history were shown all over the country, and you make note of the crowds that were especially attracted to the hat that Lincoln was wearing at his assassination. And you talk about a kind of a spirit of secular prayer, people wanting to see this in its place. And then you go on to say, these offerings give an immediate, visceral sense of human loss and memory, a tangible understanding of what really was at stake in a critical time or event. So really, the work of museums is respecting the different perspectives and giving a sense of the various stakeholders now and in the future with regard to a particular event or object.
Well, I think that's true. I would say there are two tracks here. One is a narration that is to some extent detailed, although I should never say this as a museum person. I think that a lot of those attempts turn out to be cartoons because you just can't go deeply enough to have a really complex narration. But you can make a try. So that's one. When we had our show that went around the country and it had individual objects, it was an old-style show, and it was a kind of treasure show. It had individual items in it. There were some who really criticized this. Frank Rich really lit into us in the New York Times because he said, that's just old hat, et cetera, et cetera. Well, my view is that you can do both. And depending upon your selection and how you portray it, you can rely very heavily on objects. If they're objects that are meaningful in terms of the experience, either by reading or whatever one's historical knowledge is, or by the present. So if you show the hat of Lincoln, while I didn't realize that this was going to occur, people gathered around it. Some people stayed 10 and 15 minutes just looking at that hat. It's an old stovepipe hat. That top was, I mean, it was a mess. It was certainly not a thing of beauty. Yeah. But here was the hat that was worn by this great hero of American history on the night he was killed. And it starts to evoke a lot of, probably some of them are incorrect recollection, but identification with that man through that event and a sense of veneration, which really does border on the religious. If you show the Mercury, the capsule, there are enough people who know enough about that event to be able to stand and say the actual capsule in which these guys were. It was so you can, if you show Orville Wright's, one of the Wright brothers' planes, and we had one on this tour. It was not the first one, but the fifth one that they made. You could just see by its texture, by its simplicity, by everything else, what a feat this was that people actually got off the ground in things that look like this. Well, there are just some objects that convey all kinds of things that bring about responses of respect, responses of love, but visceral kinds of responses. And I think that's also one of the jobs of museums.
Chancellor Heyman, one final question.
Yes.
Young people, students, listen to this tape. What would you like them to draw? What lessons might they learn from this journey of Mike Heyman from New York to California and beyond?
Well, I think one of them is to be as enthusiastic as possible about what you're undertaking to do when you're doing it. And don't worry too much about the future. It'll at least in my case, it took care of itself without my having to put a lot of energy into it. It's counterintuitive, and it's counter a lot of advice. But I think about this especially for those who are privileged to be able to attend a number of different colleges, and they wonder which one I should go to, and etc. The fact is, it don't make a heck of a lot of difference. If it's a good institution, it's going to push you. You could go here or there or someplace else. So don't worry about those finenesses of choice, because serendipitous things occur, unexpected things occur, and actually you don't know the turning points of your life until you look backwards. You don't know them at the time that they're occurring. So what enthuses you at the time, do. And the second one is really be enthusiastic about what you do, because it's not going to be handed to you on a plate unless you've shown passion with regard to your undertaking and worked pretty hard. I mean, hard work is still pretty necessary in order to comprehend what you're doing and to comprehend how to do that the best way that you can. So I would say enthusiasm without fear of the future and a lot of hard work at the time you're doing it, and life will pretty much take care of itself.
Chancellor Heyman, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.